Montana Territory, 1873. A blood-red sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long shadows across the valley below. Zane Lockhart slumped in his saddle, the leather creaking beneath his lean frame. At 26, his clean-shaven face still held youth, but his eyes carried the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much frontier hardship. His broad shoulders bore the weight of memories he'd rather forget. Not much further now, he muttered to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him faithfully from Colorado. The mountain air bit at his exposed skin despite the approaching summer, reminding him that elevation showed no mercy to the unprepared. Zane had long ago decided the wilderness was no place for sentiment. The war had taken his family, mining accidents had claimed his friends, and a shootout in Deadwood had stolen whatever faith he had left in humanity. The frontier demanded isolation. It was safer that way. A man alone had only himself to disappoint, only himself to bury when the inevitable happened. He patted the deed in his pocket. 10 acres and a cabin, sight unseen, purchased from a desperate miner heading back east. The description had been brief: solid walls, good hunting, no neighbors for 5 miles. Perfect. Just what Zane wanted. Somewhere to disappear, to live out his days in the solitude he'd convinced himself was the only peace a man could find in this untamed country. The trail narrowed as it climbed, winding through lodgepole pines that stood like sentinels. His horse's breathing grew labored as they ascended the final switchback. Then, rounding a bend, Zane saw it. A small clearing and the unmistakable silhouette of a log cabin nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from the chimney, dancing against the darkening sky. What in tarnation? Zane straightened in the saddle. The deed had mentioned nothing about occupants. As he approached cautiously, the cabin door swung open. Framed in golden lamplight stood a young woman, her honey-blonde hair tumbling in waves past her shoulders. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, practical for mountain living, but somehow elegant against her slender frame. She couldn't have been more than 20, her face delicate, yet displaying the determined set of someone who knew hardship. "You must be Mr. Lockhart," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We've been expecting you." Zane's hand instinctively moved toward his holstered Colt. "We?" Just a manner of speaking. She stepped fully onto the porch, revealing a small basket in her hands. "I'm Clara O'Brien. My father was Jeremiah O'Brien. This cabin was his." Zane dismounted slowly, keeping a careful distance. "I bought this place fair and square from a man named Tanner and Helena. Have the papers right here." He patted his pocket again. "Mr. Tanner was my father's partner," she explained, setting down her basket and wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "He had no right to sell, but what's done is done. I've been waiting for you to arrive so I could explain." "Explain what exactly?" Zane remained wary. Beautiful women in remote cabins typically meant trouble in his experience, usually the kind that ended with a man's pockets emptied or his throat cut. Clara's eyes, a striking green that reminded him of mountain lakes, softened. "It's a long story, Mr. Lockhart, and the night grows cold. There's stew on the fire and fresh bread. We can discuss our predicament like civilized folks, or you can camp in the woods with the wolves and bears. Your choice." Something in her direct manner disarmed him. This wasn't some saloon girl's practiced charm, but the straightforward pragmatism of mountain living. "I suppose I could hear you out," he conceded, leading his horse toward the small lean-to stable beside the cabin. "Wise choice," she replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. No man turns down a hot meal after a long ride, especially when snow's threatening. Zane glanced up at the darkening sky, noting the heavy clouds gathering. She was right. A storm was coming. What he didn't realize was that the real storm was already brewing, one that would challenge everything he believed about survival on the frontier and the walls he'd built around his heart. Inside, the cabin was modest but meticulously kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cast iron stove the other. Simple furnishings, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair beside the fire, a curtained-off sleeping area, spoke of practical frontier living. Yet small touches, dried wildflowers in a tin can, a colorful quilt on the rocker, hand-carved wooden figurines on the mantel, suggested someone had made this place more than mere shelter. Clara ladled thick venison stew into wooden bowls, while Zane sat uncomfortably at the table, his hat in his hands, feeling strangely like an intruder despite his ownership papers. "My father died 3 months ago," she said without preamble, placing a bowl before him. "Fever took him quick. His dying wish was that I wait here until spring when my aunt from Denver can send for me." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zane offered automatically, though the words felt hollow. Death was the frontier's constant companion. "But that doesn't explain why Tanner sold me this place." Clara's jaw tightened as she sat across from him. "Tanner and my father had a falling out last year. They'd been partners in a silver claim up north. When it played out, they parted ways. Father came back here to trap and hunt as he always had. Apparently, Tanner never removed my father's name from their business dealings. So legally," Zane began. "Legally, Tanner could sell his share, which he did. To you." She broke a piece of bread, steam rising as she pulled it apart. "But father left a letter with the territorial judge in Helena explaining that upon his death, his share passes to me until I turn 21 next April." Zane's spoon stopped midway to his mouth. "Are you telling me I paid good money for half a cabin?" "I'm telling you we're reluctant partners, Mr. Lockhart. At least until spring." Her directness was startling. Most women he'd encountered either simpered or schemed. Clara O'Brien did neither. "This won't work," he stated flatly. "I came here for solitude. And I came here because this mountain is the only home I've ever known." Something fierce flashed in her eyes. "My mother died, giving birth to me right in that corner. My father taught me every trail, every hunting ground, every medicinal plant on these slopes. The mountain itself raised me as much as he did." "The mountain's daughter," Zane murmured without thinking. A small smile played at her lips. "That's what the Shoshone called me when they came through to trade with father." Zane ate in silence for a moment, considering his options. He could demand she leave. He had legal papers, after all. But forcing a young woman into the wilderness with winter approaching wasn't something even his hardened conscience would allow. He could ride back to Helena, try to get his money back from Tanner, but that seemed unlikely. Or he could wait until spring, when she would leave anyway. "There's something else you should know," Clara said, interrupting his thoughts. She hesitated, then continued more softly. "Father made a promise before he died. He told me a man would come who would protect this land as he had. He made me swear to share something with that man, something valuable, once I was certain of his character." Zane's eyes narrowed. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly. He sealed it in an oilskin pouch and made me promise not to open it. Said when the right man came, I'd know, and that's who it was meant for." "And you think that's me? A stranger who bought your home out from under you?" She studied him openly, her gaze uncomfortably perceptive. "I don't know yet. That's why I said we have until spring. Time enough to determine if you're the man my father foresaw." The situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Zane had come seeking simplicity, isolation, peace. Instead, he'd found a beautiful young woman with a mysterious promise and a claim on his property. One season, he finally said, "Until the spring thaw. Then we part ways. You to your aunt, me to my solitude." Clara nodded, extending her hand across the table. Partners until spring. When their hands met, Zane felt something he hadn't in years. A spark of connection that troubled him more than any gunslinger's threat. He pulled away quickly, returning to his stew, unaware that the mountain had already begun its work, slowly dismantling the walls he'd built around his heart. The first week passed in awkward coexistence. Zane slept in the lean-to with his horse, refusing Clara's offer to share the cabin despite her practical suggestion of hanging a privacy curtain. Each morning, he'd rise before dawn, tend to his horse, check his traps, hunt if necessary, and explore the property he'd purchased. Each evening, he'd return to find Clara had prepared a meal, which they'd eat together in mostly silence before he retreated back to his cold quarters. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely had nature not intervened. 8 days after Zane's arrival, the threatening storm finally unleashed its fury, blanketing the mountain in 2 feet of snow overnight, and continuing well into the next day. Zane awoke shivering violently, his breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The lean-to provided minimal protection against the driving snow. His horse stomped nervously as wind howled through the gaps in the rough structure. "Damn it all," he muttered, gathering his bedroll. Pride wasn't worth freezing to death. He trudged through knee-deep snow to the cabin door and knocked, the cold numbing his fingers almost instantly. Clara opened the door wearing a thick woolen nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. One look at his condition, and she pulled him inside without a word, pushing him toward the fireplace where embers still glowed. "Sit," she commanded, immediately stoking the fire and adding logs until flames leapt to life. She disappeared behind the curtain, returning moments later with a quilt which she wrapped around his shoulders. "Should have come in hours ago," she chided, rubbing his hands between hers to restore circulation. "Stubborn pride has killed more men in these mountains than bears and wolves combined." "My horse," he began through chattering teeth. "We'll tend to him once you're warmed. He has more sense than you do, with that thick winter coat." There was no mockery in her tone, only practical concern. As feeling returned painfully to his extremities, Zane found himself studying Clara. In the firelight, her features softened, revealing a vulnerability at odds with her usual self-assurance. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew their place in the world, a stark contrast to his own restless wandering. "Thank you," he managed once his teeth stopped chattering. She nodded, rising to prepare coffee. "Mountain teaches hard lessons to those who won't listen. My father always said nature gives 3 warnings before it kills you. The cold was your first. Best heed it." Once the worst of the chill had left his bones, they bundled up and fought their way to the lean-to. Together, they led his nervous gelding to the small attached barn where Clara kept a milk cow and 2 goats. The animal's body heat made the space surprisingly comfortable compared to the exposed lean-to. "We'll need to dig out once the storm passes," Clara observed as they hurried back to the cabin. "Until then, we're snowbound." Being trapped together in the small cabin should have heightened Zane's discomfort. Instead, over the following days, he found himself gradually drawn into Clara's world. She showed him her father's journals detailing years of mountain observations, when to expect the first frost, where elk wintered, which slopes avalanched after heavy snow. "This knowledge kept us alive," she explained one evening as they sat before the fire. "Father said the mountain speaks to those who listen. Most just never learn the language." "And you? You understand it?" Zane asked, genuinely curious. She smiled, looking momentarily younger than her 20 years. "Not as well as he did, but yes. I was born to this life. The mountain's rhythms are in my blood." "It's a hard life for a woman alone," he observed. Something flashed in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or defiance. "Any life is hard for anyone alone, Mr. Lockhart. Man or woman. That's why my father believed in community, even out here. He traded with the Shoshone, helped lost travelers, shared knowledge with anyone who respected the land." Her words struck uncomfortably close to the belief Zane had embraced after the war. That isolation was safer than connection. That depending on no one meant being hurt by no one. "Some would say that's dangerous thinking in wild country," he countered. "And some would say the real danger is in thinking you can survive without others." She met his gaze steadily. "Even wolves run in packs, Mr. Lockhart." The storm lasted 3 days, forcing them into prolonged proximity. Gradually, Zane found himself relaxing in Clara's presence. She didn't pry into his past, but shared her own openly. Stories of growing up on the mountain, learning to track and hunt from her father, the visits from Shoshone families who taught her their language and medicines. On the 4th morning, they emerged to a transformed world. The snow lay deep and pristine, the sky a harsh, brilliant blue. Together they dug paths to the barn and woodpile. The physical labor in the crisp air felt cleansing somehow, as if the storm had washed away some of the awkwardness between them. That evening, as Clara prepared rabbit stew, Zane found himself examining the cabin with new eyes. What he'd initially seen as cramped now seemed efficient. What had felt intrusive now felt almost comfortable. "You mentioned your father believed someone would come to protect this land," Zane said as they ate. "Why would this place need protecting? It's miles from anywhere." Clara set down her spoon, considering her words carefully. "Father always said this valley was special. The streams never run dry. Game is plentiful even in hard winters. The soil in the South Meadow yields crops when others fail." She hesitated. "There've been men through here over the years. Surveyors, company men with fancy clothes and maps. Father always sent them away, saying this land wasn't for taking." "You think someone wants this property? For what? Mining?" "I don't know. Only that father was increasingly concerned in his final years. He made me memorize the property boundaries, insisted I learn every landmark. Whatever is in that pouch he left, she nodded toward a small cedar chest in the corner. I believe it has something to do with protecting this place. Zane considered this new information. He'd bought the cabin seeking escape, not responsibility. Yet something about Clara's obvious love for her mountain home stirred something long dormant within him, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Your father might have been mistaken about me, he said finally. I'm no protector, just a man looking for peace. Clara studied him with those perceptive green eyes. Perhaps true peace comes from having something worth protecting, Mr. Lockhart. The statement lingered between them, challenging the very foundation of Zane's carefully constructed isolation. As December deepened, the rhythm of mountain life gradually drew them together. Mornings were spent on essential tasks, chopping wood, tending animals, checking trap lines. Afternoons often found them hunting together, Clara's intimate knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. Evenings were passed in the warm cabin, mending equipment or preserving meat while sharing stories. Clara's freely given, Zane's offered in cautious, measured doses. Slowly, reluctantly, Zane found himself sharing pieces of his past. How he'd left Tennessee at 17 to fight for the Union. The horrors he'd witnessed at Shiloh and Cold Harbor. His aimless wandering afterward, taking whatever work kept him moving. Cattle drives, freight hauling, the occasional stint as a deputy when towns needed extra guns. I've never stayed anywhere more than a season, he admitted one evening as they worked side by side cleaning rifles. Seems safer that way. Safer for whom? Clara asked without looking up from her task. The question caught him off guard. For everyone, I suppose. People get attached, make promises they can't keep. Then when the inevitable happens, death, betrayal, abandonment, there's nothing but pain left. Clara's hands stilled on the rifle barrel. That sounds like a lonely way to live. Lonely is predictable. Predictable is safe. She looked at him then, her expression thoughtful. Is that really living, though? Or just existing? Zane had no answer. The truth was, he'd stopped distinguishing between the two long ago. The following week brought clear weather and with it, an unexpected visitor. They were returning from checking trap lines when they spotted smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Zane immediately pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Stay behind me, he instructed Clara, who ignored him completely and continued forward. It's probably Marshall, she said calmly. He visits every December before the pass is closed completely. Sure enough, a grizzled man in his 60s sat on the porch whittling a piece of wood. He stood as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile at the sight of Clara. There's my mountain girl, he called, opening his arms. Clara rushed forward, embracing him warmly. Marshall, I was hoping you'd come. Zane approached cautiously, rifle still in hand though pointed downward. Ah, you must be the new owner, Marshall said, assessing Zane with shrewd eyes. Name's Marshall Overton. I was Jeremiah O'Brien's friend for 20 years. Zane Lockhart, he replied, reluctantly extending his hand. Marshall's handshake was firm despite his age. Clara, your father would be turning in his grave knowing you're living unchaperoned with a young buck. Clara rolled her eyes affectionately. Marshall, we're partners in a property dispute, not running off to elope. Besides, Zane sleeps in the barn like a proper gentleman. Not during that blizzard last week, I'd wager. Marshall countered with a knowing look that made Zane's neck heat despite the innocent truth. I took the floor by the fire, Zane said stiffly. Miss O'Brien's reputation remains intact. Marshall laughed, a booming sound that echoed against the mountains. Son, out here reputation is what you make with your actions, not where you lay your head. Now, who's going to feed an old man who's ridden 2 days to check on his favorite girl? Marshall's visit brought new energy to the cabin. Over Clara's hearty venison stew, he regaled them with news from distant settlements, tall tales of his own adventures, and warm remembrances of Jeremiah O'Brien. Finest woodsman I ever knew, Marshall said, helping himself to more stew. Could read sign like most men read books. Saved my hide more than once. How did you meet? Zane asked, finding himself genuinely interested. Fur trading expedition, 1851. We were both young bucks then. Got separated from our company during an early snowstorm. Jeremiah found me half frozen in a ravine, dragged me to a cave, and kept me alive 3 days until we could travel again. Marshall's eyes grew distant with memory. Been brothers ever since. Came out to visit every December without fail. Clara reached across to squeeze the old man's hand. And you'll continue that tradition, I hope. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, girl. His expression sobered as he turned to Zane. So, Lockhart, Clara tells me you bought Tanner's claim. What brings a young man like yourself to this remote spot? Running from something or towards something? The directness of the question made Zane uncomfortable. Just looking for quiet. Marshall studied him thoughtfully. Quiet's one thing. Hiding's another. This mountain has a way of forcing a man to face whatever he's running from. Later, after Clara had retired behind her curtain, Marshall joined Zane on the porch despite the biting cold. The older man packed a pipe, offering tobacco to Zane, who declined. I've known Clara since she was born, Marshall said quietly, lighting his pipe. Watched Jeremiah raise her alone after her mother passed. She's as much a daughter to me as if she were my own blood. She seems capable of taking care of herself, Zane observed. Oh, she is. That's not my concern. Marshall drew deeply on his pipe. My concern is her heart. She's grown up isolated on this mountain. Doesn't know much of men and their ways. Zane stiffened. If you're implying, Marshall raised a hand. I'm implying nothing. Just making an observation that living in close quarters creates certain attachments, particularly when one party has limited experience with the wider world. I've made no overtures toward Miss O'Brien, Zane said firmly. Come spring, we'll part ways as agreed. Marshall's knowing gaze was unsettling. Intentions don't always govern outcomes, son. I've seen how she looks at you. Curious, interested. And I've seen how you watch her when you think no one notices, like a man who's found water after days in the desert. Zane started to protest, but Marshall continued. I'm not here to threaten or warn, just to say that Jeremiah believed in signs and portents. He wouldn't have left that pouch for just anyone. If he somehow knew you were coming, there's a reason. I don't believe in destiny, Zane said flatly. Marshall chuckled, tapping out his pipe. Don't have to believe in something for it to be true. Mountains were here long before any of us believed in them. He stood, stretching his back. Just keep an open mind. That's all I'm asking. Marshall stayed 3 days, his presence creating a familial atmosphere Zane hadn't experienced since before the war. The old man taught Zane tracking tricks specific to the mountain terrain, showed him how to properly smoke meat the way Jeremiah had done, and regaled them with stories of the region's earlier days. On the morning of his departure, Marshall pulled Zane aside while Clara prepared provisions for his journey. Jeremiah mentioned something to me last time I saw him, the old man said quietly. Said he'd had visitors asking strange questions about the Southern Valley. Men in suits, carrying government papers. Wanted to know about water rights, mineral deposits. Zane frowned. Clara mentioned surveyors. Marshall nodded. Keep your eyes open. Those types rarely give up easily if they think there's profit to be had. He clapped Zane on the shoulder. Take care of our girl. Whether you believe it or not, I think you're exactly who Jeremiah was waiting for. After Marshall's departure, something shifted subtly between Zane and Clara. The easy camaraderie that had developed over shared tasks deepened into something more comfortable, more natural. Zane found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, enjoying the way Clara's face lit up when describing her father's adventures or explaining mountain lore. One evening, as a heavy snow fell outside, Clara taught Zane to play checkers on a board her father had carved years ago. As they played, the conversation turned to the future. What will you do after spring? Zane asked, jumping one of her pieces. Will you stay with your aunt permanently? Clara frowned slightly at the board. No. Aunt Martha means well, but she lives in Denver society. She wants me to become a proper lady, find a suitable husband, forget this savage upbringing, as she calls it. Her voice took on a mimicking quality. She's been writing those things since I was 12. And what do you want? Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. To come back here. This mountain is my home. I just need to find a way to make that possible for a woman alone. It would be difficult, Zane acknowledged. Dangerous, even. Life is dangerous everywhere, she countered, making a move that captured 2 of his pieces. At least here, I understand the dangers. I can read weather, track game, defend myself. In Denver, I'd be expected to navigate tea parties and courtship rituals I know nothing about. Zane found himself smiling at the image of Clara in a formal drawing room, her directness certainly shocking proper society ladies. You'd cause quite a stir, I imagine. Precisely why I don't belong there. She gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall. I belong here, where the seasons tell you what to expect, where survival depends on skill rather than social standing. And what about family? Children someday? The question slipped out before Zane could consider its propriety. Clara didn't seem offended. I've thought about that, of course. I'd like children to teach the ways of this mountain, to pass on what my father taught me. She made another move on the board. But that would require finding a husband who loves this life as much as I do. Most men want to tame the wilderness, not live in harmony with it. Or they want a wife who's content to stay inside cooking and mending while they do the real work. And you want a partner, not just a husband, Zane observed. Exactly. She looked surprised at his understanding. Someone who sees me as capable, not just as a woman to be protected. Their eyes met across the checkerboard, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of how easily they'd fallen into partnership these past weeks despite their initial resistance. Your move, Clara said softly, breaking the moment. Zane looked down at the board, suddenly aware of how completely his notions of solitude had been upended by this remarkable woman and the life she represented. A life not of isolation, but of connection. Connection to the land, to its rhythms and demands, and perhaps, most dangerously, to her. The Christmas season brought new routines to the cabin. Clara decorated with pine boughs and red berries, singing carols as she worked. Zane found himself drawn into her preparations despite his usual avoidance of holidays and their painful memories. Father and I always celebrated, even when it was just the two of us, she explained while mixing dough for special cookies. He said acknowledging the passing seasons keeps you grounded. On Christmas Eve, they shared a feast of roasted grouse, preserved berries, and the special treats Clara had prepared. The cabin glowed with extra candles and firelight, creating an atmosphere of warmth that extended beyond the physical. After their meal, Clara disappeared behind her curtain, returning with a package wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. For you, she said, handing it to Zane. It's nothing elaborate. Surprised and somewhat embarrassed that he had nothing to offer in return, Zane carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a finely crafted leather belt holster, the leather tooled with an intricate pattern of pine trees and mountains. Clara, this is... He ran his fingers over the detailed work. Did you make this? She nodded, pleased by his evident appreciation. Father taught me leatherworking years ago. I noticed your current holster is cracked along the back seam. The gift touched him more deeply than he cared to admit, not just for its practicality or craftsmanship, but because it meant she'd observed him closely enough to notice such details. I have nothing to give you, he admitted, genuinely regretful. You've given plenty, she replied. Extra firewood split without being asked. Rabbit stew when I was feeling poorly last week. Listening to my endless stories without complaint. Her smile was warm. Gifts aren't always wrapped in paper, Zane. It was the first time she'd used his given name instead of Mr. Lockhart, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. I do have something else, she continued, moving to the cedar chest in the corner. She removed a small wooden box, ornately carved with forest scenes. Father made this for my mother when they married. It's my most treasured possession. She opened the box, revealing a collection of small objects, a pressed flower, a polished stone, a tiny carved wooden bear. From among these treasures, she withdrew a simple silver ring with a small green stone. This was my mother's, she explained. Father said the stone matches my eyes. I want you to keep it until spring. Zane stared at the ring in confusion. Clara, I couldn't possibly. It's not a gift, she clarified. It's a promise. A reason for you to return after I go to Denver. I don't understand. She took a deep breath. I'm not naive, Zane. I know you came here seeking solitude. But I've seen how you've changed these past weeks, how you notice the beauty of this place now, not just its usefulness, how you've started speaking of we instead of I when discussing winter preparations. She held the ring out to him. When I leave in spring, take this. If you find you miss this mountain, and perhaps the mountain's daughter, bring it back to me in Denver. If not, sell it and use the money to buy supplies. Either way, it ensures our paths will cross again, one way or another. The gesture stunned him. It wasn't a declaration of love or a demand for commitment. It was something far more powerful. An acknowledgement of possibility. A door left deliberately open. Slowly, he extended his hand, allowing her to place the ring in his palm. The metal was warm from her touch. "I'll keep it safe," he promised, carefully tucking it into his shirt pocket. "And I'll return it to you, one way or another." They sat in comfortable silence then, watching flames dance in the fireplace, each contemplating the unexpected paths that had led them to this shared Christmas and the uncertain future that lay beyond. Neither could have imagined how that future would be violently thrust upon them the very next day. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, the snow-covered landscape glittering like diamonds under the sun. Zane rose early, determined to surprise Clara with fresh meat for their holiday dinner. He left a note by the stove and headed out, following deer tracks that led toward the southern valley. The hunting was good. By mid-morning, he'd bagged a young buck and was field dressing it when he heard voices in the distance. Curious and cautious, he covered the carcass with branches and moved silently toward the sound. In a clearing about half a mile from the cabin, 3 men on horseback had stopped. Their city clothes and clean-shaven faces marked them as outsiders. One held maps which he consulted while gesturing toward the stream and surrounding terrain. "The survey confirms it," the man said, his voice carrying in the crisp air. "The aquifer runs directly beneath this valley. With the railroad coming through the territory next year, whoever controls this water controls development for 50 miles. "What about the existing claim?" asked another, a heavy-set man with an expensive-looking hat. "Fractured ownership. Half belongs to some mountain girl, half to a drifter who bought in recently. Should be easy enough to pressure them to sell, especially with the territorial governor's backing." "And if they won't sell?" The first man folded his map deliberately. "Then accidents happen in these mountains all the time. Nobody questions a cabin fire or a hunting mishap out here." Zane's blood ran cold. These were the men Marshall had warned about. Not just surveyors, but speculators with powerful connections and no compunction about using force. He backed away carefully, returning to his kill. He needed to warn Clara. As he hoisted the dressed deer across his shoulders, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering a tree trunk inches from his head. "Hold it right there," called a voice he didn't recognize. Zane dropped the deer and dove for cover behind a fallen log, drawing his pistol. Another shot kicked up snow near his position. "We know you're there," the voice called. "Just want to talk business." Zane remained silent, assessing his situation. He was outnumbered and potentially outgunned, with limited cover. "The property you're squatting on has been designated for territorial development," the man continued. "We're authorized to offer fair compensation to vacate. Seems like shooting at folks is an unusual negotiation tactic." Zane called back. A different voice responded, smoother than the first. "A misunderstanding. We thought you might be a hostile native. These mountains can be dangerous." "Not as dangerous as claiming land that isn't yours to take," Zane replied, keeping his position hidden as he tried to determine how many men he faced. "Be reasonable," the smooth voice continued. "The territory is progressing. Development is inevitable. $1,000 for a worthless mountain claim is more than generous. Take your offer elsewhere. This land isn't for sale." A pause followed. "Perhaps we should discuss this with the young woman at the cabin. She might be more amenable to reason." The implied threat sent a surge of protective fury through Zane. "You go near her, and our next conversation will be conducted through gunfire." Laughter floated through the trees. Big words from a man pinned down and outnumbered. "Think about our offer. We'll be back after New Year's with papers. Be smart. Take the money and move on. People who stand in the way of progress tend to get run over." Zane waited until he heard horses retreating before cautiously emerging from cover. The deer carcass lay where he dropped it. He hoisted it quickly and set off toward the cabin by a circuitous route, watching for signs of being followed. When he reached the clearing, he saw Clara on the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line anxiously. Her face flooded with relief when she spotted him. "I heard shots," she said as he approached. "What happened?" Inside, as they prepared the deer, Zane recounted his encounter with the speculators. Clara's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Father feared this would happen," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The last 2 years, he noticed more strangers passing through, asking questions about water flow, even in winter when the high passes should be impassable. They mentioned the territorial governor's backing," Zane said. "That makes this more complicated than just running off trespassers." Clara's jaw set in a determined line. Complicated doesn't mean impossible. This land has been in my family for 20 years. I won't surrender it to men who see only profit where I see home. Her fierce protectiveness stirred something in Zane. Admiration, certainly, but also a growing sense of shared purpose. This wasn't just her fight anymore. Somehow, it had become his as well. "We need to be prepared," he said, cleaning his knife methodically. "They'll be back, and not just with papers." That afternoon, they took inventory of their weapons and ammunition. Between Clara's father's firearms and Zane's own, they had 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and enough ammunition to withstand a small siege. They discussed defensible positions, escape routes, and how to secure the cabin against both frontal assault and more subtle dangers like fire. "Father's pouch," Clara said suddenly as darkness fell. "I think it's time to open it." She retrieved the oilskin package from the cedar chest. It was sealed with wax and bound with rawhide. Clara broke the seal carefully, unwrapping layers of protection to reveal several folded documents. The first was a hand-drawn map of the property, with detailed notations about water sources, cave systems, and defensible positions. The second was a deed, the original land grant signed by a territorial official in 1853, establishing Jeremiah O'Brien's full ownership. "This contradicts what Tanner sold you," Clara said, studying the document. "According to this, my father was sole owner, not partners in the property." The final item was a letter addressed simply to the protector. Clara handed it to Zane with trembling fingers. "I think this is meant for you." Zane hesitated before unfolding the paper. The handwriting was bold and clear. "To the one who reads this, asterisk, if my daughter has given you this letter, she has judged you worthy of the truth. This land contains more than game and timber. The southern valley sits atop an underground river, a vast aquifer that remains full even in the worst droughts. In a territory where water means life, this secret has power. Asterisk, asterisk, for 20 years, I've guarded this knowledge, sharing it only with the Shoshone who understood its sacred nature. But men with maps have come, asking questions that reveal their intentions. They seek not to nurture, but to exploit. Asterisk, asterisk, I have seen your coming in dreams, a young man seeking solitude, but finding purpose instead. The mountain chose you as it once chose me. Whether you believe in such things matters little. What matters is your choice now. Asterisk, asterisk, this land belongs to my daughter by right and blood. But its protection may require strength beyond hers alone. Stand with her, and the mountain will reveal all its secrets and blessings. Abandon her, and something precious will be lost forever, not just water and trees, but the rare magic of a place that remains as God made it. Asterisk, asterisk, choose wisely, protector. Some treasures, once lost, cannot be reclaimed. Asterisk. Jeremiah O'Brien. Zane read the letter twice before silently passing it to Clara. He watched her face as she absorbed her father's words, saw the moment understanding dawned in her eyes. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow, he knew you would come." "It's not possible," Zane said, though without conviction. "Your father never met me." "The mountain speaks to those who listen," Clara replied, echoing her earlier words. Father listened better than anyone. They sat in silence for a long moment, the letter between them like a bridge connecting their separate worlds. "What will you do?" Clara finally asked. "You didn't ask for this responsibility." Zane stared into the fire, considering. 6 weeks ago, he would have packed his belongings and ridden away from such complications. The thought of fighting for a piece of land, of standing against men with power and connections, would have seemed foolish beyond measure. But something had changed. In this remote cabin with this remarkable woman, he'd found something he'd stopped believing in, a purpose beyond mere survival, a place that felt right in ways he couldn't articulate. "Those men threatened you," he said slowly. "That alone would keep me here." He met her gaze directly. "But there's more. Your father was right about one thing. I came seeking solitude. Instead, I found." He gestured vaguely, struggling to name the complex emotions the cabin and its surroundings now evoked. "Home," Clara suggested softly. The word hung between them, both question and answer. "Maybe," he conceded. "I don't know yet. But I do know I won't let them take this place without a fight." Clara's smile was radiant, transforming her already beautiful face into something that caught his breath. "Then we stand together." The decision made, They began preparing in earnest for the confrontation they knew was coming. The following days were spent reinforcing the cabin's defenses, creating caches of supplies in case they needed to flee into the mountains, and establishing signals they could use to communicate if separated. New Year's Eve arrived with no sign of the speculators. They celebrated quietly, sharing the last of Marshall's whiskey and watching the stars through the cabin window. "I've been thinking," Clara said, breaking a comfortable silence. "About what happens after." "After what?" "After we deal with these men. After spring comes." She turned to face him fully. "I don't want to go to Denver." Zane studied her face in the firelight. "Your aunt is expecting you." "I could write to her. Explain that circumstances have changed." Her voice grew softer. "That I've found a reason to stay." The implication was clear. Zane felt his heart quicken despite his efforts at caution. "Clara, I'm not the man your father envisioned. I've done things. We've all done things," she interrupted. "The question is who we choose to be now." She reached for his hand, her touch sending warmth up his arm. "I choose to be a woman who recognizes what matters when she finds it." Zane looked down at their joined hands. "And what matters to you?" "This mountain. This home." She paused, gathering courage. "And you, Zane Lockhart. The way you listen when I speak of things others would dismiss. How you respect my strength without diminishing it. How you've started to see beauty again, not just danger." Her honesty humbled him. For weeks, he'd been fighting his growing feelings, telling himself it was merely proximity and shared purpose creating an illusion of connection. But sitting beside her now, with the year about to turn, such self-deception seemed impossible to maintain. "I came here to disappear," he admitted. "To find a place where no one knew me or needed anything from me. Where I could forget all the death I've seen and caused. And instead, I found you. Stubbornly alive, fiercely connected to everything around you, demanding that I see the world as something more than a series of threats to survive." He squeezed her hand gently. "You make me want things I stopped believing were possible." "Like what?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Like a future worth planning for. Like waking up to the same mountains every morning. Like building something that lasts." The space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with unspoken possibilities. Clara's free hand rose to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with wonder. "Then build it with me," she said simply. When their lips met, it felt like recognition rather than discovery, as though some part of him had been waiting for this moment since he first saw her framed in the cabin doorway. The kiss was gentle but sure, a promise rather than a question. As they separated, the distant sound of horses broke the spell. Zane was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Riders," he said grimly. "At least 4, coming up the main trail." Clara joined him at the window, her expression shifting from tenderness to determination. "They're early. Stay inside," Zane instructed, checking his pistol before strapping on the holster she'd made him. "I'll meet them in the clearing." She shook her head firmly. "We face them together. This is my fight too." There was no time to argue. They quickly donned coats and armed themselves, positioning strategically on the porch as the riders emerged from the tree line. For men reined in at the edge of the clearing. Even in the dim light, Zane recognized the 3 he'd encountered in the woods. The 4th, riding slightly ahead, was older and more expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of authority. "Evening, folks," called the well-dressed man. "Sorry to disturb you so late. I'm Judge William Hargrove, Territorial Circuit Court. These gentlemen work for the Territorial Land Office." "Strange hours for official business," Zane replied, keeping his rifle visible but pointed downward. "Indeed, but we have a pressing schedule." The judge's tone was pleasant but carried an undercurrent of impatience. "We've come about a property matter that requires immediate attention." Clara stepped forward. "If it concerns this land, I'm Clara O'Brien, daughter of Jeremiah O'Brien, the rightful owner." "Ah, Miss O'Brien. Yes, that simplifies things." The judge reached into his saddlebag, withdrawing papers. "I have here an order of condemnation under territorial eminent domain. This property has been designated essential for development. You'll be compensated fair market value, of course." "By whose authority?" Clara demanded. "The territorial governor himself. The railroad requires water access for the new line." The judge's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Progress waits for no one, my dear." Zane stepped up beside Clara. "We have the original land grant signed in 1853. This property isn't subject to territorial claims. The judge's expression hardened slightly. Young man, I don't believe we've been introduced. Zane Lockhart, co-owner of this property. One of the men leaned toward the judge, whispering something. The judge nodded. Mr. Lockhart, I understand you purchased an interest from a Mr. Tanner. Unfortunately, Mr. Tanner had no legal right to sell. The O'Brien claim supersedes his alleged partnership. Then we agree on that point, Zane replied. Which means you're dealing solely with Miss O'Brien and myself as her designated representative. The judge studied them both for a moment. I see. Well, the condemnation order stands regardless. You have until the end of January to vacate. The compensation is more than generous. We're not selling, Clara stated firmly. Not to you, not to the territory, not to the railroad. This land has been in my family for 2 decades. Miss O'Brien, the judge's voice took on a patronizing tone. You're a young woman alone in the wilderness. Your father's passing, while tragic, necessitates practical considerations. This offer provides for your future security. I'm not alone, Clara replied, her shoulder brushing against Zane's. And my security isn't for sale. The judge's false congeniality vanished. Don't be foolish, girl. This development will proceed with or without your cooperation. The governor himself has signed these orders. Then the governor can come explain personally why he's stealing land that was legally granted, Zane interjected. Until then, you're trespassing. I suggest you leave. One of the men behind the judge moved his hand toward his gun. Instantly, Zane's rifle came up, aimed steadily. That would be unwise, he said quietly. The judge held up a hand, stopping his companion. Violence serves no one's interests here. We'll return with federal marshals, if necessary. You do that, Zane replied evenly. And we'll be waiting with our legal documentation and witnesses who can attest to Mr. O'Brien's sole ownership. Something flickered in the judge's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or doubt. This resistance is pointless. The territory's development cannot be impeded by 2 people. You'd be surprised what 2 determined people can accomplish, Clara responded, especially when they have justice on their side. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the judge nodded curtly, tucking the papers back into his saddlebag. You have until the end of January to reconsider. After that, I can't guarantee the process will remain this civilized. He turned his horse. Good evening to you both. They watched in silence as the 4 riders disappeared back into the forest. Only when the sound of hooves had faded did Clara release a shaky breath. They'll be back, she said. With more men next time. Zane nodded, keeping his rifle ready as he scanned the tree line. But we've bought time. And that judge wasn't as confident as he wanted us to believe. What do we do now? Zane turned to her, struck by the fierce determination in her eyes. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't, leave her to face this alone. Now, he said, we get ready for a fight. And not just with guns. He gestured toward the cabin. Your father's deed, the map, his letter, they're our best weapons. We need to get them to someone with authority who isn't in the governor's pocket. Clara's eyes widened with sudden inspiration. Marshall. He mentioned having a friend who practices law in Helena. Someone who's fought the railroad before. Can we get word to him? She nodded. There's a trading post 30 miles east. The owner sends riders to Helena every 2 weeks with mail and orders. Then that's our first move. Zane reached for her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. We'll ride out at first light. Together. Clara's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Together, she echoed, the word now carrying weight beyond its simple meaning. As they returned to the cabin to prepare for their journey, Zane felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for victory against the men who threatened their mountain home, but for a future that stretched beyond the immediate battle. A future with Clara beside him, building something that would outlast them both. The mountain had indeed worked its magic, dismantling his carefully constructed isolation and replacing it with something far more powerful. A purpose worth fighting for, and a love worth risking everything to protect. The weeks that followed unfolded in a blur of activity. Their ride to the trading post proved successful. They found a trustworthy courier willing to deliver a sealed package to Marshall's lawyer friend in Helena. The package contained copies of Jeremiah's deed, his letter, and a detailed account of the judge's visit and threats. While awaiting a response, they continued strengthening their position. Zane taught Clara more advanced shooting techniques, while she showed him hidden caves and passages throughout the property that could serve as fallback positions if the cabin became indefensible. January was half gone when a rider arrived from the trading post with a letter. The news was mixed. Marshall's friend, a lawyer named Edward Callahan, confirmed that their deed appeared legitimate and predated any territorial claims. However, the governor had indeed signed an order of condemnation, claiming the land was essential for railroad development. Callahan is filing counterclaims with the Federal Land Office, Zane read aloud from the letter. But legal proceedings move slowly. He advises us to hold our position while he seeks an injunction against any forced removal. How long will that take? Clara asked. Weeks, maybe months. Zane folded the letter thoughtfully. The question is whether the judge and his men will wait for legal processes. They had their answer 3 days later when lookout points they'd established spotted a large group approaching, at least 10 riders, heavily armed, led by the judge. They're not here to negotiate, Zane observed grimly as they watched from a concealed position above the trail. Clara's face was set in determined lines. Then we implement the plan. Their strategy was defensive rather than confrontational. They had carefully removed all valuables from the cabin, including Clara's mother's jewelry box, Jeremiah's journals, and essential supplies. These were cached in a small cave high on the mountainside, along with extra ammunition and food. As the riders approached the cabin, Zane and Clara were positioned in the dense forest on opposite sides of the clearing, each with clear sight lines but excellent cover. The judge dismounted, approaching the silent cabin with apparent confidence. When no one answered his knock, he signaled to his men. 2 of them immediately began pouring liquid from cans around the cabin's foundation. Coal oil, Clara whispered from her hiding place, horror evident in her voice. They're going to burn it. Before Zane could respond, a shot rang out from somewhere to their left, not from any of their positions. The unexpected gunfire sent the judge's men diving for cover, horses scattering in panic. More shots followed, seemingly from multiple directions. Zane scanned the tree line in confusion. They had no allies, no one else who knew of their predicament. Then he spotted movement. 3 figures in buckskin, firing methodically from the cover of the forest edge. Their long hair and distinctive rifles identified them immediately. Shoshone, Clara breathed. Father's friends. The judge's party returned fire haphazardly, shooting at shadows and movement. Outgunned and caught in the open, they began a disorganized retreat, dragging their wounded. This isn't over, the judge shouted toward the cabin as he mounted his horse. You're harboring hostiles now. That's a federal offense. The firing continued until the last rider disappeared down the trail. Only then did the 3 Shoshone warriors emerge from the trees, approaching the cabin cautiously. Clara stood from her hiding place, calling out in a language Zane didn't understand. The warriors responded, lowering their weapons. As Zane joined her in the clearing, Clara made introductions. This is 2 ravens, his son Swift Arrow, and his brother Gray Wolf. They were my father's closest friends among the eastern Shoshone. 2 ravens, a dignified man in his 50s with streaks of gray in his long black hair, studied Zane intently before speaking in accented but clear English. Jeremiah O'Brien was blood brother to me. His daughter is as my daughter. He gestured toward the retreating dust cloud left by the judge's men. We have watched these bad men for many days. They destroy sacred places, pollute waters. We will not allow them on this mountain. We're grateful for your help, Zane said, extending his hand in friendship. 2 ravens clasped his forearm in the traditional manner. Jeremiah spoke of one who would come, a warrior with eyes that have seen too much death. He nodded with satisfaction. You are this one. The Shoshone refused to enter the cabin, preferring to make camp at the forest edge. As night fell, they shared information around a small fire. 2 ravens explained that his people had been watching the judge and his men for weeks, tracking their destruction of other homesteads and sacred sites. They build iron road through our hunting grounds, Gray Wolf said bitterly. Drive away game, cut down forests. Say it is progress. The law may not protect us, Zane admitted. We've sent for legal help, but these men have powerful connections. 2 ravens nodded sagely. White man's law is like river. It bends around the stones of wealth and power. Then what can we do? Clara asked. We can't fight the entire territory. The older warrior smiled slightly. When enemy is strong in numbers, wise warrior changes battlefield. Makes enemy fight where his strength becomes weakness. His cryptic advice became clear the following day. The Shoshone led them on a tour of the property, showing how they could use the terrain itself as a weapon. They identified choke points where riders would be forced into single file, slopes where loosened rocks could create impassable barriers, streams that could be diverted to wash out trails. "We will not kill unless necessary," two ravens explained. "But we will make this mountain reject them like body rejects poison." For 3 days, they prepared the land, setting trip lines across trails, preparing rock slides that could be triggered with a single shot, creating false trails that led to impassable terrain. The Shoshone taught Zane and Clara how to move silently through the forest, how to leave misleading tracks, how to use owl calls and wolf howls as signals. On the 4th morning, scouts reported a larger force assembling in the valley below, nearly 20 men with supply wagons. "They prepare for siege," Gray Wolf observed. "Think they can starve us out? Then we don't let them reach us," Zane decided. "We implement the plan immediately." What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a campaign of frustration and attrition. The judges' forces found their primary trail blocked by fallen trees, too massive to move easily. When they attempted alternate routes, they encountered washed-out crossings, carefully concealed pitfalls, and the occasional warning shot that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. After a particularly devastating rock slide separated half their party from their supplies, the judge called for a parley. Zane agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a meadow visible from multiple defensive positions where Clara and the Shoshone could provide covering fire if needed. The judge appeared haggard, his fine clothes now dirty and torn. The confident authority he'd projected earlier had given way to frustrated rage. "This is madness, Lockhart," he snapped as they faced each other across 20 paces of open ground. "People will die if this continues." "That's entirely up to you," Zane replied calmly. "You're trespassing on private property with armed men, attempting to seize land by force. In most places, that would justify lethal defense. You're harboring hostile Indians, interfering with territorial development. I'm protecting my home alongside friends who have every right to be here," Zane interrupted. "And I've received word this morning that a federal marshal is en route from Helena with an injunction against your condemnation order." This was a bluff. They'd had no such communication. But the judge's expression told Zane the arrow had struck home. "You're lying," the judge said, but without conviction. "Am I? Our lawyer filed federal papers 2 weeks ago. How long before questions start being asked about a territorial judge leading armed men against legal homesteaders? How many telegrams have already reached Washington?" Uncertainty flickered across the judge's face. "The governor may not appreciate being implicated in an illegal land grab," Zane finished for him, "especially if it involves violence against a young woman whose father was a respected pioneer. The newspapers in Helena would find that quite interesting." The judge's jaw worked as he calculated his options. "What do you propose?" "You leave today. Take your men and go back to Helena. Our lawyer will contact you through proper channels regarding our counterclaim." "And if I refuse?" Zane gestured to the surrounding forest. "Then we continue as we have been. But next time, the warning shots may find different targets." For a long moment, the judge seemed to wrestle with his pride and ambition. Finally, practicality won out. "This isn't over," he warned. "The railroad will come through this valley eventually." "Perhaps," Zane conceded, "but it will do so legally, with fair compensation, or not at all." By nightfall, the judge's force had withdrawn completely. 2 ravens and his companions remained another day, helping restore the cabin and ensuring no adversaries lurked nearby. Before departing, the Shoshone leader presented Zane with a beautifully crafted hunting knife. "You have become Mountain's protector, as Jeremiah foresaw," he said solemnly. "My people will know you as friend." After the Shoshone left, Zane and Clara returned to the cabin that had so nearly been lost. Though physically unharmed, the structure somehow felt changed, more precious for having been defended, more truly theirs for having been fought for together. "Do you think they'll come back?" Clara asked as they sat before the fire that evening. "Not soon," Zane replied. "The judge risked too much already. His reputation would be ruined if his actions became public knowledge. And the railroad? That's a longer fight. But we have the legal papers, witnesses, and now allies. He reached for her hand. We'll face whatever comes together. Clara's fingers intertwined with his. Together, she repeated softly. I like the sound of that. February brought heavy snows that effectively sealed the mountain passes, providing a natural defense against any further intrusions. In the peaceful isolation that followed, Zane and Clara's relationship deepened from partnership into something more profound. They spoke openly of the future now, plans for expanding the cabin, improving the small barn, perhaps adding a proper garden come spring. They talked of children who would learn the mountain's ways as Clara had, of building a legacy that would outlast them both. As the first signs of spring began to appear in late March, snowdrops pushing through melting drifts, longer days, the return of songbirds, a rider appeared on the trail. Clara spotted him first during her morning check of their lookout points. A single rider, she reported as she returned to where Zane was repairing winter damage to the cabin roof. Moving slowly. Doesn't look like trouble. They watched together as the figure approached. As he drew closer, Clara gave a cry of recognition and ran toward the trail. Marshall. The old man's weathered face broke into a broad grin as he dismounted to receive Clara's embrace. There's my mountain girl. Hale and hearty as ever. I see. Zane approached more slowly, extending his hand once Clara released the older man. Marshall ignored it completely, pulling him into a rough hug instead. You did it, son, Marshall said gruffly. Stood your ground just like Jeremiah would have. We had help, Zane acknowledged. What news from Helena? Marshall's expression turned triumphant as they walked toward the cabin. The best kind. Edward Callahan is a crafty old fox. He not only secured a permanent injunction against the condemnation order, but uncovered evidence that the judge and the territorial secretary were taking bribes from the railroad. They've been arrested? The judge has resigned in disgrace. The secretary is under investigation. And most importantly, Marshall reached into his saddlebag, withdrawing an official-looking document. I bring a federal confirmation of your title. Both your names, clear as day. No one can challenge it now. Clara took the paper with trembling hands, reading aloud. Hereby confirm the joint ownership of the property known as O'Brien Homestead to Clara O'Brien and Zane Lockhart in perpetuity. Joint ownership? Zane questioned. But I only purchased Tanner's claim, which wasn't even valid. Marshall's eyes twinkled. Callahan thought it best to establish both your claims officially, given the circumstances. Something about ensuring no future challenges could separate the property. He winked at Clara. Though I suspect he assumed certain other arrangements might eventually make such legal distinctions unnecessary. Clara blushed beautifully, avoiding Zane's gaze. Marshall laughed at their mutual discomfort. Don't tell me you two have been living in this cabin all winter and still dancing around what's obvious to anyone with eyes. It's not that simple, Marshall, Clara began. Isn't it? The old man looked between them with fond exasperation. Life's too short for unnecessary complications. Jeremiah knew it. That's why he left his letter for the man he knew would protect both his daughter and his mountain. Later, after a celebratory dinner and many shared stories, Marshall retired to the lean-to, which had been converted into a proper guest cabin during the winter months. Zane and Clara stood on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear spring sky. He's right. You know, Zane said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. We've been avoiding the obvious. Clara turned to him, her expression open and vulnerable in the starlight. Have we? I think we both knew from that first Christmas Eve. He took her hands in his. I came here seeking solitude, convinced that isolation was safer than connection, that the frontier was no place for anything beyond mere survival. And now, her voice was barely above a whisper. Now I understand what your father knew all along, that true strength comes from what we build together, that this mountain isn't just a place to hide from the world, but a place to create something worth protecting. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing the silver ring she had entrusted to him months ago. The green stone caught the starlight, glinting like Clara's eyes. You gave me this as a promise that our paths would cross again, he said, holding it between them. I'd like to return it as a different kind of promise, that our paths will never separate again. Tears glimmered in Clara's eyes as she understood his meaning. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Zane Lockhart? I'm asking if the mountain's daughter would do me the honor of becoming my wife. His voice was steady despite the thundering of his heart. of building a life here that would make your father proud. Clara's answer was to step into his arms, her lips finding his with perfect certainty. When they finally parted, she held out her hand, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger where it belonged. Yes, she said simply. 1,000 times yes. Their wedding took place in early June, when the mountain meadows exploded with wildflowers. Marshall officiated, having secured the necessary authorization from Helena. 2 ravens and his family represented the Shoshone, bringing gifts and blessings from their people. Edward Callahan rode up from Helena to witness the union and deliver the final legal papers securing their claim against all future challenges. Even Clara's Aunt Martha made the journey from Denver, initially scandalized by her niece's unorthodox living arrangements, but gradually won over by the obvious devotion between the young couple and the remarkable home they were creating. Under a canopy of pine boughs and wildflower garlands, Zane and Clara exchanged vows that blended traditional promises with their own words, pledges to honor the mountain that had brought them together, to preserve its beauty and secrets for generations to come, to build a legacy of stewardship rather than exploitation. As Marshall pronounced them husband and wife, Clara whispered words meant only for Zane's ears. The mountain has chosen well. My father would be so proud of the protector it sent me. Zane's answer was equally soft but filled with certainty. Not just a protector now, but a partner. In all things, always. That evening, after their guests had retired to tents scattered around the property, the newlyweds stood on their cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in hues of gold and purple. Clara wore a crown of wildflowers in her honey-blonde hair. Zane had actually shaved his light stubble for the occasion, looking younger and more carefree than he had in years. I was thinking, Zane said, his arm around his wife's waist, that we should expand the cabin before winter. Add a proper bedroom, maybe a small room for future considerations. Clara smiled up at him, understanding his meaning perfectly. Children should have space to grow, and this mountain has many lessons to teach them. The first of many generations to call this place home, he agreed, kissing her forehead gently. The beginning of our legacy. As darkness settled over the valley and stars emerged above the peaks, Zane reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had purchased a lonely cabin seeking isolation, only to find the greatest connection of his life waiting for him. He had believed the frontier offered nothing but survival, only to discover it could provide the deepest kind of belonging. Most miraculous of all, the false belief that had driven him for so long, that a man alone was a man safe from loss, had been transformed into a new truth, that a life shared was a life truly lived, and love was worth every risk. Inside the cabin, a lamp glowed warmly, casting its light into the gathering darkness. Not just shelter now, but home. Their home. Forever. The mountain had indeed spoken, and Zane Lockhart had finally learned to listen.